Hello, Internet! I've missed you! Today, we're gonna do something a little bit different. We're gonna be taking a look back at a movie that I almost never think about. Pyramid of Light, the first and worst of the three Yu-Gi-Oh movies. I haven't sat down to watch this film in its entirety since I saw it in theaters all the way back in 2004. And this will be like an old DVD commentary track. I'm gonna put the film on and give you my thoughts as I go through it. I encourage you to watch along, but for copyright reasons, I can't upload the whole video here on YouTube. If you want to stream the movie along with this video, that works too. That's probably better than watching whatever I've put together here. I'll do a sync point for this in just a sec so we can get started at the same time. But before I do that, I want to talk about this channel's first ever sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Meyer to Meyer Entertainment. Meyer to Meyer is a family-owned performing arts and immersive event company specializing in interactive theater, and right now, you can join them for Haunted Soiree, a macabre cocktail party. The Halloween season is fully upon us, and I can't think of a better place for horror fans to go than Haunted Soiree, where you'll enjoy a night of fine drinking, performance theater, and scream-inducing scares. Meyer to Meyer Entertainment's Halloween experiences have been voted the best haunted house attractions in the country by PR Newswire and Forbes magazine. Haunted Soiree is open now in 7 US cities, so if you live in Los Angeles, New York City, Dallas, Seattle, Nashville, Chicago, or Washington, D.C., get your tickets now. And if you buy a silver or gold tier ticket using the code SPELLCOMMANDER91, that's all lowercase SPELLCOMMANDER91, you'll get $2 off and a portion of your ticket sale will go back into this YouTube channel. You know, so I can post more than twice a year. I cannot recommend this experience enough. The Meyers are close personal friends of mine, and I've worked on or attended every one of their horror events for the last decade. Tickets are available for weekends for the rest of October and Halloween night. And if you go to the 7 p.m. showing in Los Angeles on Halloween, you might even see me there. So, get your tickets for Haunted Soiree now. Link down in the description. And now, back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Feel free to stick around through the end credits for some updates on the channel. The movie begins with the 4K Media Incorporated logo on my copy of the Blu-ray, so that's where we're gonna start in 3, 2, 1, go. I suppose it's also worth mentioning that while I haven't seen this movie since I saw it in theaters, I did see it in theaters 6 times because I was trying to collect all the promotional cards that they were giving out with tickets for this movie. So, may not have seen it in a while, but I think I remember it pretty well. We'll find out. I don't know. I'm excited. So the movie starts off with this recap of the premise of the series, and then immediately goes into a scene of Yugi solving the Millennium Puzzle for the first time. And that was the first time that we as the audience ever got to see that. The first episode of the show, where Yugi duels Kaiba, actually takes place in, I want to say, the 9th volume of the original manga that Kazuki Takahashi wrote. The first 8 volumes weren't adapted into the show. You see little bits and pieces of them sprinkled in here and there, things that took inspiration from them, but those stories weren't adapted, and that happened for a couple of reasons. One, there was Yu-Gi-Oh! Season 0, which was an original attempt at adapting the series by Toei Animation. That show wasn't particularly well received and got canceled after 27 episodes, I think. So they didn't want to retread all the stuff that Toei had already done, lose existing audience members by retreading ground. Some other franchises that I talk about on this channel could learn a lesson from that. But also, Yugi's duel with Kaiba was really where the show started, or I'm sorry, where the manga started to be about the card game. The original 8 volumes kind of changed what game was being played all the time, and Duel Monsters, as it eventually came to be known, was intended to just be a one-off. It wasn't going to appear again, except it was so popular, the storyline that it was introduced in was so popular, that there were fan requests to Jump Magazine to make a version of the game that kids could actually play. And so eventually they did, which eventually led to them deciding, oh, we need another anime in order to promote this. But since the anime was going to be exclusively about promoting the cards, they didn't want to readapt all the stuff that wasn't about the card game from beforehand. They just wanted to get straight to the card game so they could get kids buying cards. Man, oh man, did that work out for them, because, yeah. But anyways, it's cool that they use this movie as an opportunity to go back and show that moment, because it's such a big moment in the story, and the fact that it was skipped over entirely in the anime is kind of disappointing. It makes sense, but still disappointing. Oh, and of course, it's right here in the first scene that 4Kids gets it wrong with the translation. Throughout the entire English localization of the series, they always say that the Pharaoh's battle in the ancient Shadow Games, that all took place 5,000 years ago, when in the Japanese version, it's 3,000 years ago. And that change happened because in the very first episode, in the Japanese version, it says that games in general, the idea of playing games, started in ancient Egypt over 5,000 years ago. And 4Kids kind of just took that as like, oh, whatever happened in the past happened 5,000 years ago. And while this movie does correct a few dumb things that 4Kids did when they were adapting the television series, that wasn't one of them. That's still wrong right here in the first scene. But, oh well. It's a pedantic complaint compared to some of the other things that they've done. Okay, so there's the Pyramid of Light, and... Okay, here's my thing with this movie. It follows the same, almost the exact same plot structure as Dark Side of Dimension. You have a secret 8th Millennium item that nobody ever knew about. I don't care that the Pyramid of Light isn't a Millennium item. Yes, it is for all intents and purposes. You've got an 8th Millennium item. You've got a villain who's somehow related to the past villain in some way, who shows up and forces a duel or a conflict between Yugi and Kaiba, and Yugi's trying to talk Kaiba out of it, and Kaiba's just like, no, my pride, my ego, we're gonna do this, even though it's exactly what the bad guy wants us to do. And Dark Side of Dimensions just does that story so much better. That movie had a lot more heart to it. It essentially took the exact same premise and used it in a much deeper way. It was a movie about grief and seeing how Yugi and Kaiba were handling their grief now that Atem had moved on. Essentially, they had lost the person who meant most to them and were dealing with it in very different ways. But for Kaiba, he'd lost a part of himself that he didn't even realize that he had. He had a dependence on his rivalry with the Pharaoh that he didn't understand until after the Pharaoh was gone. Probably doesn't understand until the very end of that movie. But Kaiba is just an idiot in this movie. He's just there to do the wrong thing and make the bad things happen and be an inadvertent pawn for the bad guy, with no real incentive to do it for himself other than, oh, my ego hurts. I guess what I'm really saying is that I wish this kid's movie had a better character motivation, and maybe that was too much for me to expect. But not really when you consider how good the series can be in other places. The entire franchise, really. Oh, Yu-Gi-Oh! The movie. God, they wanted this to be Pokemon the first movie so bad. And check out that early 2000s CGI. Pump that fractal noise effect to the max. It's just cool to see how the CGI and effects have changed over the years and how much more advanced the tools have gotten. Nowadays, this is like baby's first After Effects project. So this scene here, where we get to see a recap of the events of the anime, and we get to see them make a really big deal out of Yugi having the Egyptian god cards, that hadn't happened yet in the show when it was airing in America. This movie came out while Yugi's duel with Merrick was airing. I think like only the first episode of that 5-episode story had aired. So this movie completely spoils the end of Battle City if you went and saw it opening weekend. I mean, we all knew he was going to, but he didn't officially have Winged Dragon of Ra yet when this movie came out, which I think is just a funny bit of trivia, looking back at it all these years later. And that really didn't need to be the case. This movie came out in America before it came out in Japan. For Japanese audiences, the movie came out like a month after the show aired its final episode. So this was like a bonus chapter that people got after the story had already concluded. But here in the United States, it actually came out 3 months earlier, and it's 12 minutes shorter. I've never found confirmation on this, but what I think happened was Warner Brothers had already started advertising the release date here in the United States, and it became clear that the movie wasn't going to be done in time to meet that release date. So I think they just kind of said, give us whatever you've got, and you can worry about the rest of that stuff later for your release, but we're going to try to stick to our release window, which is kind of crazy. That doesn't really happen where you see anime airing here in the United States before it airs, you know, where it was actually made back in Japan. It's just such a weird decision, though, to look back on, because it is a direct spoiler for the story that was airing at the time. And if they had just waited for the movie to be finished and waited the extra 3 months, then that story would have been wrapped up and they would have been in the lull between seasons. And instead, this movie came out and basically spoiled the next month's worth of episodes. I'll come back to the content that was cut out of the movie for the American release in a second, but just while we're here on this moment in the film, there's a really cool moment that's coming up where Kaiba's on top of the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, and Yugi jumps up onto Obelisk the Tormentor, and the two of them square off. And I've seen a lot of people comment on forums and on Reddit over the years asking, why does Yugi jump up on Obelisk? You know, Slifer was his ace god monster, why is he using the other one? And, you know, there are answers that people give like, well, Obelisk's effect is the one that's most suited to the moment, or Obelisk was Kaiba's card, so Yugi's sort of mocking him by using his old god card to take him down. And that's actually not the reason. There's actually a really cool ancient Egyptian mythology reference going on here. And what an obelisk is a monument that holds a Ben stone, which represents the mound of land that the god Atem stood upon when he created the world in ancient Egyptian mythology. So for the Japanese audience, this was intended to be a reference to something they had just learned at the very end of the show as it had wrapped up for them. But it wouldn't have meant anything to audiences here in the United States because obviously we didn't know the pharaoh's name at that time. We didn't know that he was named after the god Atem or was some sort of a reincarnation of the god Atem or something like that. But yeah, when I learned that for the first time, when I realized what this was a reference to, I thought that was so cool. The show isn't really all that concerned with being authentic to Egyptian mythology, but when it does subtlety with its references, it's usually really nice. And if you're an archaeology fan or a mythology fan like I am, those Easter eggs are always just kind of fun. It's also kind of funny how once you know that the pharaoh's name is Atem and you know the mythology behind it, you realize that the Egyptian god cards are backwards in terms of which card goes to which character. An obelisk represents the story of Atem. Those two things go together, so it makes sense for Yugi to be the one to have that card. On the other hand, Osiris is sort of the opposite of Atem. Atem was the god of creation, Osiris is the god of death. And there's a conversation between the two of them where Atem tells Osiris, you and I are going to be the last beings in creation. When all of reality has fallen back into the primordial waters, you and I will be the last things here. And that kind of hints at this idea of an eternal rivalry, which works really well for Yugi and Kaiba, but which character had which card is clearly backwards. And Slifer's a dragon. Like, why didn't Kaiba have the dragon? Make Slifer blue and give him to Kaiba. Make Obelisk red like he was for 5 seconds at the beginning of this movie and give him to Yugi, and whole thing would have made a lot more sense. And also, just to continue this mythology tangent for one more second, because nothing interesting is happening in the movie at this point, Atem is also a sun god. Atem is revered as the god of the setting sun, whereas Ra, who is obviously the third god monster in this show, is revered as the god of the midday sun. Over time, as religious practices changed, Ra sort of replaced Atem as one of the most important gods in the Egyptian pantheon, and I think even further over time, they sort of amalgamated in belief and practice. The god was sort of collectively known as Aten Ra. So it's sort of interesting how the monsters, Ra and Obelisk, kind of correspond with the pharaoh's sacred name, whereas Slifer's kind of a rival, and that was the one that ended up being his ace monster. Going back to the footage that was cut out of the American release in order to make the release date on time, the extra 12 minutes of footage is kind of interesting. You can go online and just find compilation clips of it or something like that, but it's not really a whole lot of substantial material by any stretch of the imagination. It's usually just an extra line here and there, or some extra frames of animation, a shot or two that got cut out. There are only a couple of real scenes that got added in, and one of them has to do with Yugi's grandpa, who's on screen right now, totally timed that. One of them has to do with Yugi's grandpa watching him solve the Millennium Puzzle for the first time at the very beginning of the movie, and he sees Yugi do it, and then just kind of mutters to himself, and is like, oh crap, the person who solves the puzzle is supposed to become bonded with the god of darkness or something like that, or the king of darkness. I probably shouldn't have done that. I probably shouldn't have given that to him. Whoops. Hope I didn't just cause major trouble for him later on down the road. And that scene is just so ridiculous. It just repaints Yugi's grandpa as such an idiot, which is only minor character assassination, if we're being honest. And here we are with the Blue Eyes White Jet, like the 11th most memeable thing in this entire show, which if you haven't kept up with the actual card game or anything like that in a while, they have now released Blue Eyes White Jet as a monster that you can play in the game in reference to this thing here. But I love this thing, and I think it goes so well with Eric Stewart's over-the-top performance and portrayal of Kaiba. The way that he just decided to deliver all of Kaiba's lines was so extra and so over the top, and then the fact that he made a jet to look like his favorite trading card on top of that just feels so in character with the character. It still works in the Japanese version, it absolutely does, but I've never thought of Kaiba being quite as over the top and self-centeredly melodramatic as the Eric Stewart performance whenever I watch the Japanese material. So this is one place where I'm like, yeah, the English performance gets a few things a little bit better, and the Blue Eyes White Jet just works better because of the English adaptation. In my opinion, you might feel very differently. So now we have Kaiba flying off to go challenge Pegasus on Duelist Kingdom Island, looking for some way to possibly overcome the God cards, anything he can get his hands on to beat Yugi and get his reputation back. And very quickly here, we're gonna run into Pegasus and find out that he's just not interested in being a part of this world anymore. He's more than happy to stay on his fancy private island and get drunk all day. I actually like how in the English adaptation of the movie, they're willing to say that Pegasus is drinking red wine spritzers and getting drunk on his island, whereas in the Saturday morning cartoon on Kids WB, they changed it so he was drinking fruit juice and reading comic books and things like that in order to soften the character. But in this version, he's like, yeah, I don't want to duel you, I'm just here getting lit. Bite me. And this is another one of those places where I wish the movie had a little bit more sophisticated writing like Darkseid did, because really this scene is just the two of them machoing at each other in different ways, and Pegasus has no real motivation to come out of retirement here. In a second, Kaiba's gonna offer up to wager his 3 Blue Eyes White Dragon cards in order to get him to come out of retirement and duel him, but Pegasus owns the company that publishes the game. He could print as many Blue Eyes White Dragon cards for himself as he wanted. If he wanted to, he could flood the entire market with Blue Eyes cards in order to make Kaiba just not special anymore. But as soon as Kaiba offers them up, which he's about to in a second, Pegasus is all in. And I guess you could kind of read it as he's just such a chaotic neutral character that he wants to humiliate Kaiba, but he's already done that once. This scene really just exists in order to answer the question of who's better at dueling, Kaiba or Pegasus, because their first duel, Pegasus was cheating, so it didn't really count. In this match, since it's a fair fight and Kaiba's ultimately going to win, we get to see that yes, he is still the number 2 duelist in the world. His only other opponent who's ever taken him down besides Yugi wiped the slate clean. He's back to being basically on top, almost, just so close. And then the movie goes ahead and cliffhangers this scene. They break up the story with Yugi and the story with Kaiba into different sections and just sort of intercut them throughout the movie for the first little bit. And I understand why they're doing that. They don't want us to get away from any character for too terribly long, but I do feel like it really disrupts the pacing. They built hype for that duel between Kaiba and Pegasus, and then it kind of lets the wind out of your sails when you come to this kind of ridiculous scene where all of Yugi's adoring fans are trying to challenge him for the Egyptian god cards. But of course, this scene is going to get a pass from me because it is, for all intents and purposes, the Joey scene. It's his one real time to shine in this movie, which is unfortunate. Joey is my favorite character for a lot of reasons, and he kind of gets shunted off to the side in all the movies and doesn't really get too many moments in the spotlight. But damn it, this is his time in this movie. The Godfather of games. And shout out to Wayne Grayson for his portrayal of Joey in this movie and the entire series. Like Dan Green and like Eric Stewart, he does such a phenomenal job bringing this character to life. And Wayne Grayson, the guy is named after Batman and Robin. How cool is that? But if I can get on my soapbox about Joey for just a second, he's the best duelist in this show, hands down. I know that Yugi is the king of games and Kaiba's the whatever the hell he is by the end of it, the sore loser of games, and Joey is the third-rate duelist with a fourth-rate deck, but no, he isn't. Joey's got the most prolific improvement streak in the show. You know, he goes from being the dumbass who doesn't know anything about the game to being a top contender in Duelist Kingdom, which is a tournament that he should have won. He was in the final round with Yugi, and the only reason that he lost is because Yugi put a Trojan horse in his deck. Yugi gave him the Time Wizard at the beginning of Duelist Kingdom as they were on their way to the tournament and said, hey, this will be really useful for you, which admittedly it was. It was the thing that bailed him out of a lot of situations, but Yugi never told him, oh, by the way, this could also facilitate a really great combo in my deck if you happen to play it while my ace monster is on the field. King of Games might ache an ass. His best friend was a better duelist than him. Yugi needed someone else to help him out in every single duel. He had to have a second person looking over his shoulder and basically playing the game for him. Joey did everything on his own. Like, even going into Battle City, yeah, I'm really staying on this soapbox. I feel this strongly about Joey's mistreatment in the show. Even when you get to Battle City, Joey is beating cheater after cheater after cheater. Weevil cheats in his duel, Esperoba cheats in his duel, Odeon cheats in his duel. Merrick makes it a shadow game, which is basically cheating in his duel. And Joey beats Merrick. Like, yes, technically he loses because he passes out, but he had Merrick dead to rights, and it was only because he didn't have a Millennium item or anything like that to let him stay conscious for the duel that he loses. But Joey won. He beat the big bad of the season in all but a technicality, which Yugi and Kaiba couldn't do that. They both were like, I need to stack 2 Egyptian god cards in order to take on Merrick. And Yugi couldn't even do it until Kaiba gave him an extra card right before his duel with Merrick started. Joey did it without any of that crap. As far as I'm concerned, Joey is the undisputed king of games. And Yugi's just the bad friend who set him up for failure at the beginning of Duelist Kingdom. Now, I know that might be a little bit of a hot take. I know there might be some angry comments down below, but hashtag Joey's the true king of games. I say as he's lying on the ground with spirals for eyes. I also like how in this next scene with Yugi and Taya, they're like, quick, we need to find a place to hide from all these angry gamers. The museum! Nerds wouldn't be caught dead in there! At least not those kinds of nerds. But before the movie can bore us with any mumbo-jumbo or ancient history, we come back to the duel between Kaiba and Pegasus, which is taking place on one of Pegasus's old dueling arenas, which I think Kaiba developed those. I think it was like a thing that he was using a state-of-the-art Kaiba Corp proprietary solid vision arena in his first duel with Yugi, and that was something Yugi had never gotten to do before. But in this, Pegasus asks Kaiba what he thinks of his state-of-the-art arena, and Kaiba's just kind of like, you're as antiquated as your arena, old man. Let's just get to the game. And I'm like, Kaiba, didn't you develop those arenas like 2 years ago? Like, you were bragging about how amazing they were not that long ago in terms of the story. But anywho, yeah, so this is a fun duel. It's not, none of the duels in this movie are actually all that, exciting compared to some of the multi-parters in the show. That's kind of one of the weaker parts of this movie as far as I'm concerned. And Pegasus in general, or Pegasus in particular, is kind of a disappointment just in terms of how we get to see his character through the cards that he's using. They defaulted back to having him use Toon monsters like he did in the earlier parts of the Duelist Kingdom finals when he dueled first Kaiba and then later Yugi. And the Toon monsters are cool. They go with his personality, but at a certain point in his duel with Yugi, that facade gets washed away and we get to see the angrier, more archaic version of Pegasus through monsters like Relinquished and Thousand Eyes Restrict. And I understand how now that Pegasus has lost the Millennium Eye, maybe that part of his personality has kind of been wiped away. They do kind of make him into a good guy following the end of Duelist Kingdom, since he survived in the anime, whereas in the manga he died when Bakura took the Millennium Eye. So I guess the Toon monsters do kind of work for this sort of neutral / kind of good guy version of Pegasus. But that was never the most interesting version of Pegasus. And this isn't the most interesting version of the Toon monsters. I think it would be much more interesting if Pegasus had a Kaiba-focused Toon deck. Like, maybe he had multiple Blue Eyes Toon Dragons, and we got a Blue Eyes Ultimate Toon Dragon. Specifically because The card that Pegasus is holding on to, the one that Kaiba's really here for, putting aside, Anubis screwing with the plot, is the Blue Eyes Shining Dragon. And so I kind of wish that we had that contest of Blue Eyes in order to earn it. Which character is really the more worthy Blue Eyes duelist. I know Blue Eyes isn't an archetype that Pegasus is really known for. He's more known for like the Toons and the Relinquished type stuff. But since they put the Blue Eyes Toon Dragon in here, I think that would have worked better, especially because I don't really care for having Pegasus using Toon version of Yugi's monsters as well. Like, we've got the Toon Dark Magician Girl here, and just, it's underwhelming as far as I'm concerned. I think they could have been a lot more creative with their choices here. I could nitpick it to death, but at a certain point it just comes down to, I wish they had done something with a little more variety. All of that being said, this is a duel between two characters who aren't exactly good guys. It's not straight up a villain duel like Merrick versus Bakura or anything like that, but Kaiba's definitely a selfish bastard, and Pegasus is kind of chaotic, sometimes evil, sometimes good, more in his neutral phase at this point in the story, but definitely not a good guy outright. And he's clearly getting off on the idea of humiliating Kaiba here and wants to put him in his place and thinks that he's better than him. He's coming from a place of superiority, so just watching these personalities bounce off of each other is a little bit more fun than something like watching a negative personality bounce off of someone like Yugi, who by the end of Duelist Kingdom is such a heroic character, and in that case, playing the straight man isn't always the most entertaining person to watch when duels are happening or when conflict is happening. But getting to see these two who just can't stand each other and want to put the other one in their place just as much as the other one does, it's a lot more fun as far as I'm concerned. These are the duels that make the franchise a little bit more interesting. Also, have you ever noticed how all of the Toon monsters are pretty nice representations of the monsters they're based on? Like, Blue Eyes Toon Dragon is definitely a cutesy version of Blue Eyes White Dragon. Dark Magician Girl, or Toon Dark Magician Girl, is definitely a cutesy version of Dark Magician Girl. Toon Summon Skull is a nightmare. I mean, that is... The regular Summoned Skull is like a skeletal demon creature, and somehow that is less terrifying than looking at his Toon counterpart. Whoever was the art person behind that, good job is all I can say, because that thing is freaky, and I remember being freaked out by that as a kid, and I hope there were small children all over the world who had nightmares over that. Also, this is a rather low energy duel for how high the stakes are. This is supposed to be the creator of the game versus its former world champion, so you would want some of the pomp and circumstance, some of the high energy that you get in some of the bigger duels from the anime, like, even like Yugi versus Kaiba, or Yugi versus Merrick, or even some of the smaller duels like Kaiba versus Joey. There's a lot of back and forth, and those go on for a little while. It's obviously hard to have a lot of long duels during a feature-length film, but this one just feels, like I said, kind of low energy compared to some of the better duels for the show, and that's one of the reasons why this isn't a broad statement. Darkseid is obviously an exception, but I just don't feel like this franchise works all that well in feature-length film format. By the time you get to the end of Battle City and Duel Monsters, you've got matches that are going on for 4 or 5 episodes. I mean, they almost are feature-length all by themselves. So you're trying to cram the same amount of story that you would have in a full arc into the amount of space that the show sometimes allows for just a single matchup, and so everything in here feels a little bit rushed and a little bit less special than it might otherwise if it was getting the kind of time that you'd get in the show. And that kind of cheapens moments like this one. Right now, Kaiba's winning the most powerful card in the game, the card that can defeat the god monsters, but that wasn't very hard. He didn't really have to go through that much of a trial or an ordeal in order to get them, and obviously this falls in line with the plot of the film. Anubis wanted him to win, and so it's not like he's actually just easily getting the solution to all of his problems. He's sort of being handed even more problems that he doesn't recognize yet. But all of this to say, just the really long way of saying, I wish Kaiba versus Pegasus had been a much bigger deal and that we'd gotten to see a lot more reverses and trade-offs between the two. And I think that the idea of giving them a rematch in this movie was probably a little too ambitious for its format. I don't think that that was ever going to work well in a feature film format. But anyway, we're in the museum now, so let's get historical. The main antagonist of this film is named Anubis, and of course, if you're familiar with Egyptian mythology, Anubis is one of the gods of the dead. I mentioned earlier that Osiris was a god of the dead, so is Anubis. Historically, they represent two different facets of death. Anubis is considered to be the god of mummification and embalming. He's the one who guides spirits through the process of death and weighs their souls in judgment for whether or not they deserve to enter the afterlife. Whereas Osiris, on the other hand, is considered to be the pharaoh of the afterlife. He's the ruler of the afterlife and commands all souls that have made it that far. So in that sense, Anubis is the god that brings souls to Osiris. And in some accounts, Osiris is actually Anubis's father. So if you're applying that logic to this film, there might be some sort of relationship between Slifer the Sky Dragon and Anubis. It's not really clear, and they're never really paired off against one another, but just archaeologically speaking, there is some connection there. But of course, this character isn't the god Anubis. There's actually an implication that they are two separate and distinct characters in this universe. I think Shoddy mentions in the Duel Monsters anime, and I think in the manga, that he serves the god Anubis, and it's never implied that he serves this lunatic. I think they're two separate characters. In this story, Anubis is a sorcerer who lived around the same time as the pharaoh. They were contemporaries with one another, and he worked with Akhenaten, the pharaoh's uncle, in order to try to create a replica of the Millennium Puzzle. He wanted to create his own version of it so that he could pass it down to Seto, so that eventually Seto would be able to challenge Atem and become the pharaoh, which didn't end up happening because Anubis stole it for himself. And he started using its power in order to attack the pharaoh and try to conquer Egypt and control the world himself. This movie says that Atem was the one who stepped in and defeated Anubis and sealed the Pyramid of Light away, but I don't really know when that would have happened within the course of the story, because Atem's father dying is what immediately precedes the battle with Zork. So if Atem had access to the god powers and was able to use the gods in order to conquer Anubis and vanquish him, then that would have had to have happened after his father died and after Atem became pharaoh. But basically his entire story as pharaoh takes place in the immediate couple of days following that. There wouldn't have been time for this story to have taken place back in ancient Egypt unless it was basically happening in between the scenes of the Millennium World storyline. And I know the Millennium World RPG isn't supposed to be a beat-for-beat reenactment of what happened back in the past. Maybe there is some wiggle room, or that wasn't taking place over such a truncated period of time. I don't remember if they ever say anything about that. But yeah, just from my recollection in watching this movie, it doesn't actually fit anywhere into the timeline. I don't know where this movie would take place exactly, or rather where its backstory would take place within the rest of the backstory of Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's probably one of the reasons why I don't think this movie was ever considered to be canon. I don't really care about getting into big canon arguments the way that a lot of people on the internet do. I'm kind of like, make your own headcanon as you're going through, because it's about what you have fun doing, not what the rest of the world has fun doing when they're watching their shows. But I don't think this movie counts. I don't really count it myself when I'm trying to create the theory videos or anything like that. And just to interrupt myself while we're in the middle of this scene does something really cool that I don't think the show ever really bothered with, which is it creates a physical headspace where Yugi and the Pharaoh get to talk to each other, and I like this. I know that the inside of the Millennium Puzzle is supposed to be that maze of stairs, and we see that later on in this movie, but this little void area that they've created here, where Atem is just staring at the god cards and has them represented as a part of his mind space, since they're tied to his lost memories. I think that's a really cool touch, and I wish the show had done something like this more. I can't remember if they ever do that. I think most of the time it's just you see Yugi's semi-transparent form next to him in whatever environment they're in, but that little void is cool, and the show should have done that more, especially considering the franchise would just continue to repeat the Yugi and Pharaoh formula forever. You've got Jaden and Yubel, who kind of get bonded together during GX. You've got sort of kind of Yusei and the Crimson Dragon, not really. Okay, I've stopped caring about that this scene. I want to talk about Kaiba's entrance here because it is just so over the top fantastic. I love the fact that he gives himself a laser light show and projects holograms of the first couple of monsters are his. I don't like that all the other monsters are Easter eggs for other characters. It should have all been his monsters, but he gives himself this grand over the top entrance. And then when Yugi walks in, it's just like, hey, Yugi walked in. No light show for him, no holograms for him. It's right up there with how in Battle City he does the clash in the Coliseum and he gives him and Yugi this big over-the-top hologram spectacle of an audience for the semifinal match. And then by the time you get to the match with Merrick, he's like, I don't give a shit about that. Just do whatever you're gonna do. Stand on top of the tower and get this over with so I can blow up the island and go home. I love how narcissistic his character is. Like, everything about him, everything he owns, his jet, how he tricks out his building, how he decorates things, everything just points to this overinflated sense of importance, and you don't really get that for the other characters. You don't get as much environmental or ancillary storytelling in the visuals with Yugi and Joey the way that you do with this guy, and it's because his personality is just so much bigger than theirs and takes up so much more space than them that you get all these really unique opportunities for him to just stroke his own ego, and more self-reflective characters like Yugi and the Pharaoh, and God, I can't believe I'm saying this, but Joey of all people, there's just not room for that. And it's just a testament to how well this character works. God, even in movies where I don't like the plot that they have written for him, I can't help but praise how great of a character Kaiba is. Maybe I lied earlier. Maybe Kaiba's my favorite character and Joey's in second place. The two trade back and forth a little bit. And I know the movie's about to get into the duel between Yugi and the Pharaoh, but screw it. I'm going to talk about Kaiba and Joey for a second because I like them better. I hate the Battle for the Bronze match that the anime did for them in Battle City. It was almost a Dragon Ball-esque need or impulse to have a very clear delineation of who is better than who, and to have a ranking leaderboard where you could know that Yugi is definitively on top and Kaiba's underneath him and Kaiba's ahead of Joey and Merrick falls wherever he falls or whatever. Or I guess Merrick would have been in second place, whatever. But the story didn't support Kaiba beating Joey at that point in the plot, both on a narrative level and just on a mechanics level in terms of what performances we were seeing up until that point in the story. On a narrative level, Kaiba learns a lesson, or he's supposed to learn a lesson when he loses to Yugi, especially in the manga, because that's really the last you see of Kaiba in the story. He doesn't show up in the Millennium World storyline. The only version of Kaiba we see for the rest of the story after Battle City is pre-Seto back in the past. Whereas in the anime, they obviously did Waking the Dragons and the Grand Prix and all that other stuff. But going back to Battle City, Kaiba is supposed to have that crushing defeat after the clash in the Coliseum. His entire worldview was based on the idea that he could win alone, that he didn't need friends and didn't need anyone else in his life, and that he could take all the power that he needed and become the best of the best all on his own. And in his duel with Yugi, that's just fundamentally proven not to be true. Yugi has the support of his friends. It's obviously a very big thing that the Red Eyes Black Dragon is in his deck. So using the antithesis of Kaiba's philosophy, Yugi crushes him. And he's not supposed to have catharsis after that, especially if you look at Dark Side of Dimensions, which is a sequel to the manga, not the anime, where that battle for the Bronze Duel never would have happened. You see him in that movie and he's broken. He never recovered from his loss in Battle City. That moment haunted him, and there was no catharsis or respite afterwards in order to help him move on or feel better with his life. So I hate that they gave him that moment of victory in the anime, especially considering Joey subscribes to the exact same belief and principles that Yugi does. He's always fighting for other people and with other people. So I don't like that the show validated Kaiba's path to power is the path alone mentality by letting him beat Joey after he had just had his ass thoroughly kicked by Yugi. And also, as I've already mentioned, Joey beat Merrick by himself. As far as I am concerned, he is the Battle City runner-up. Merrick got into the finals on a technicality, and Joey got robbed. And based on that, based on the fact that Joey could beat Raw without a single Egyptian god card, that he managed to do what Yugi and Kaiba could not have done or were too scared to do because they both wanted to make sure that they had stacked 2 Egyptian gods to take on Merrick's 1. Joey didn't have any of that. He took down Merrick. He should have been able to take down Kaiba at that point. And I actually think that the story would have been more powerful if Joey had beaten Kaiba at that point, because he gets this crushing defeat from his rival, Yugi, and that obviously shakes him. That's his entire worldview thrown out the window, or at least challenged and proven not to be a foolproof plan. And so then he'd be like, well, at least I can still beat up this other person who I think is an easier opponent, you know? I may not have been able to beat Yugi, but I can still beat this other person that I don't respect. You know, Joey's the third-rate duelist with a fourth-rate deck, and so if Kaiba had played against him and lost that duel as well, that would have completely forced him to reevaluate his outlook on life. Because losing to Yugi, that was of course devastating in its own right, but he respects Yugi. It's the sort of thing where at least he was a worthy foe that took him down, whereas Joey's someone he doesn't respect at all. And if someone like that was suddenly able to overcome him, it would show just how in the wrong Kaiba was in terms of his own mentality. And I think that would have been a better story. Especially going into the ambiguous ending that Battle City had, where Yugi and Joey have another duel with one another, and then, of course, in the anime, he has Red Eyes Black Dragon back again. It would have seemed like a much more fair fight between the two if Joey had beaten Kaiba, and it really is kind of the number 1 and number 2 duelist from Battle City going up against one another, rather than number 1 with all 3 god cards versus confirmed number 3. I personally think that the way that the manga handled it is much, much better, and kind of makes it feel like it's an even match between the two of them at the end of that story, and the anime just took away all the credibility from that, and once again, just a place where I feel like Joey's character got the shaft in terms of how the anime developed things. But it looks like the plot of this movie is actually starting, so maybe I should talk about that. So we've had Yugi and Kaiba dueling back and forth this entire time, and Kaiba forced Yugi to play all 3 of the Egyptian god cards in one turn, which I thought trap cards didn't affect the Egyptian gods, but apparently that one does. And then played the Pyramid of Light, which is the card that Anubis snuck into Pegasus's possession in order to get the plot of this movie rolling. Not really sure why he needed to bother going through the whole process of giving it to Pegasus so that Kaiba could win it. Arguably, Pegasus hadn't even wagered that card, and if Pegasus had been the one to open up the briefcase himself and hand over the Blue Eyes Shining Dragon to Kaiba and realized, oh, hey, there's this other card that I don't recognize in here, Pegasus would not have handed that over to Kaiba. Things had to work in just such a specific way for Anubis's plan to work, whereas I think it would have been much simpler if Anubis had just put the Pyramid of Light on the top of Kaiba's deck at some point. Like if Kaiba's just going through his own cards later and he's like, hey, I don't recognize this one, and then reads the effect and he's like, oh, defeats the god cards. Not sure where this came from, but I'm sure as shit dumb enough to play it and try it in my computer and see if it works. It just kind of makes the entire duel with Pegasus feel like it was unnecessary when you look at it that way. But anyways, Kaiba played the Pyramid of Light, and now Yugi is trapped inside of the Millennium Puzzle, and the Pyramid of Light almost seems like it's infecting the puzzle. Like we saw that flashback earlier where the giant Pyramid of Light and the giant Millennium Puzzle are colliding into one another, and this hallway seems really smashed up and damaged, as though it's been in a collision with the pyramid. And of course, the pyramid's mummies are inside of the Millennium Puzzle, which Yugi and his friends will run into later. And I think there's a representation or a facsimile of the pyramid in there as well. So there's this interesting idea of even Yugi's safe space has been infected in this movie, which is a cool idea, but all of this is really boring. Like, none of the characters are doing anything all that interesting when they get in here. It's just sort of, well, the Pharaoh and Kaiba are dueling. We needed something for the other characters to do, so they put them in this predicament inside the puzzle, which just is not interesting. Running from zombies is not interesting. The fighting that they get into later isn't impressive to watch or all that interesting. And the characters aren't doing anything character-y. Joey could have easily been replaced by Bakura or Odeon or any random character from the show, and it wouldn't make a difference once they get inside the Millennium Puzzle. The only thing that ends up being distinctly character-focused going forward inside the puzzle part of the story is when Taya gets in there and does her whole the power of friendship spiel, which, oh my god, is so overdone in this movie. I don't particularly like Taya as a character. I know that's offensive to some people, but she was kind of a non-entity in the anime for me, and what she's best known for is the really over-the-top Saturday morning cartoon power of friendship speeches, and, ooh, that was violent. Sorry, got distracted there really quickly. Penton stabbed Yugi in the back, and you don't get to see stuff like that in the anime all that often. Movie clearly had different censorship rules. What the hell was I saying? Oh yeah, I hate Taya, and I think she's a worthless character, and I want to throw up in my mouth a little bit every time she starts going on about the power of friendship. I found it corny as all hell when I was 10 years old, and now, 20 years later, it's so much worse. So the fact that that kind of becomes the solution at the end of this movie, the fact that Taya says, Yugi, remember the power of friendship, or Yugi's in the puzzle at that point, Pharaoh, remember the power of friendship, and he does, and then suddenly he's able to overcome Kaiba, and then overcome Anubis, and then together he and Kaiba overcome Anubis, and at the end they wrap it all up by saying, and the real cards were the friends that we made along the way. And just, that's not an interesting take on this show. Friendship was the thing that let Yugi beat Kaiba in the very beginning. It was the thing that let the Pharaoh stand up to Pegasus in their duel. It was the thing that kept Joey going in the Battle City Final so he could save Mai. It was the thing that kept Yugi going during the Battle City Final so that he could save Joey. The show has just done the power of friendship thing to death, and it's done it in much more interesting ways than this movie does it, because on just a writing mechanics level, the characters have everything they need to beat this movie basically as soon as the conflict is introduced. Kaiba gets the Pyramid of Light and the Blue Eyes Shining Dragon at the exact same time. Yugi has his bonds of friendship at the very beginning of this movie. And so, basically from the moment the Pyramid of Light is introduced, these characters already have everything they need to beat it. There's no quest for additional power. No one has to learn anything new or change their philosophy or find a way to improve to overcome the challenge of this movie. Anubis really does just show up as a challenger for our characters to swat down. Yugi had to develop new powers and really learn how to use the Millennium Puzzle in order to defeat Pegasus, and the entire Battle City arc is spent with him acquiring the cards and working up to the point where he can even think about challenging Merrick. But Anubis just shows up and the heroes already have the keys to defeating him, and it's just not interesting. And having him use friendship to defeat this enemy rather than having to overcome a flaw in his own character or do anything that continues his story with the Pharaoh, it feels like lazy writing. The plot always takes the path of least resistance just to move you from point A to point B, and things aren't really motivated by character or storytelling so much as we just want this to look cool and we want to sideline the characters that aren't really useful for the story so that we can keep them out of the interesting bits. And while I don't think that there was really anything for Yugi or the main cast to do during the actual duel between the Pharaoh and Kaiba or the Pharaoh and Anubis, sidelining them like this just isn't great. I almost wish they had done something to write Joey, Tristan, and Taya, and Mokuba, and maybe Yugi's grandfather out of the story earlier, like, you know, something that puts them in a coma or seals their souls away or something, because the story's just trying to juggle having them here, and they're kind of taking away from everything. In fact, I think that might have been a good way to up the stakes, because going into that duel between Yugi and Kaiba, the Pharaoh's like, Kaiba, I sense something amiss here, we shouldn't do this. And Kaiba's like, nope, we're dueling anyways. And really, there's no reason that the Pharaoh had to accept, other than just the principle of, you never turn down a challenge, that this show seems to imply. But if the rest of the supporting cast had already been in danger, and the Pharaoh needed to duel Kaiba because he couldn't think of any other way to save them, well then suddenly you have some stakes, and you have character motivation, rather than just, well, it's a Yu-Gi-Oh show, they're gonna duel anyways. I mean, the way that this story is structured, it basically feels like Kaiba could just show up at Yugi's door in the middle of the night at any time and be like, duel me! And, well, he issued a challenge, so he has to. This isn't a tournament, this isn't a competition. There's no real reason for the Pharaoh to even be in this match, in this story. And in fact, from a plot perspective, it actually would have made more sense if he said, yeah, I don't think I should be a part of this. We can do this later. Have your people call my people, and we'll get something on the books at some point in, you know, several months. Tell you what, friend, you can duel me if you can beat my associate, the Godfather of games. Ooh, I'm already liking that idea for a rewrite of this movie better. Just make the whole movie about a duel between Kaiba and Joey, and this would have been the best Yu-Gi-Oh movie ever made, hands down. But I digress, and for all my criticisms of this part of the movie, I do actually like the duel between Yugi and Kaiba. I like the back and forth of it. It is easily on par with the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon duel back in Duelist Kingdom. Not quite up there with the Clash in the Coliseum, because that's one of the best matchups that this franchise has ever had, but this works really well, and I like the new monsters that they're both given. This is something I actually do think this film does better than Darkseid, because I don't really love a lot of the evolutions of their cards that are introduced in that movie. I like Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon, to be sure, but in this movie you've got Penton the Dark Clown, who's sort of an evolution of Sagi the Dark Clown. You've got Magician's Valkyria, who seems to be related to the Dark Magician Girl. You've got the Sorcerer of Dark Magic, who seems to be an evolution of the Dark Magician. And of course, eventually we'll get to the Blue Eyes Shining Dragon, who I'll talk about a little bit more later. But this movie did a really good job of updating or upgrading the characters' decks to be something that's new but still familiar. You know, I used to do a lot of the deck profile videos on this channel, the sort of thing that was, what kind of cards would Jaden have used during Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains, or what kind of cards would Yusei have used during Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5, or something like that. And that idea actually came from this movie, and seeing how there are variations of the same monsters, or upgrades or retrains of the same monsters, and that as the game progressed, you'd see the characters' decks progress. Like, the cards that Yugi used during Duelist Kingdom, much like they aren't great today, weren't competitively viable even by the end of this show. They always had to be upgrading and continuing to improve what they could do in the game. But we had already seen them build up relationships with their cards. It was a little bit like Pokemon or Digimon, where certain cards had emotional significance to the characters, so you wanted to see them hold on to those cards even though they stopped being viable in the game. Not that these characters ever really cared about being tournament viable in real life, but at a certain point you needed to see them get better, or you needed to see them be able to do things that were more competitive at the very least. And this movie did a good job of that, and that's something that I do give it a lot of props for. On the other hand, though, Sorcerer of Dark Magic and Blue Eyes Shining Dragon are such difficult cards to summon that I wouldn't really call them viable strategies either, but the fact that Yugi and Kaiba get those monsters out on the field and can do so much with them in these movies makes them seem like more powerful versions of the Blue Eyes White Dragon and the Dark Magician, and I don't know, it was exciting to me in the same way that seeing a Pokemon evolve or seeing a Digimon Digivolve is exciting. If only they'd given my boy Joey a new Red Eyes card or something like that, then I would have been completely happy and I would have forgiven this movie for everything. Although, as a player, I will say, this was frustrating when the movie was coming out in theaters. The movie gave you, whenever you went and bought a ticket for the movie, they gave you one of 4 trading cards. I think it was Wadapon, the Pyramid of Light, one of the Sphinx monsters that Anubis uses, or the Blue Eye Shining Dragon. You could get one of those 4 cards, and you were most likely to get Wadapon, which absolutely sucked. But when you got the Blue Eye Shining Dragon card, that was supposed to be the most exciting one. That was sort of the mascot of the film, and it was the rarest one that they were handing out. I think I got like 3 Wadapons before I finally pulled the Blue Eye Shining Dragon the last time I went to see this movie. But when you get that card, that excitement got so undercut by the fact that one of its summoning requirements is you have to sacrifice a Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, which is fairly easy to get a hold of now, but at the time was basically impossible to get. You had to be very lucky, or I don't know if there were trading markets that I wasn't paying attention to at the time I was 10, but it wasn't an easy card to get your hands on is the point. So there was just this utter sense of disappointment when you get this awesome mascot card from the movie and you're like, oh, there's no way in hell I could ever play this thing. And that wasn't just me. This card never really saw any competitive play from what I understand. I don't really keep up with the competitive game very often. I'm not a competitive player by any stretch of the imagination. If you want to find that out firsthand, go watch Wham Bam Duel's Dimension Destination episode where he and I did a collaboration together, and you can see me get humiliated pretty embarrassingly. I'll link to that in the description for anyone who's curious. But yeah, Blue Eye Shining Dragon was kind of a letdown card, considering how much hype was around it in the promotional material for this film, and they made a big deal in the promotion about, you could get the Blue Eye Shining Dragon card when you went to see the movie. And anyone who got it was kind of like, oh, this is going in a sleeve somewhere, or going at the bottom of a box and never getting used. Even the fact that you had to sacrifice a monster like Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon that has so many attack points, and what you get immediately is weaker by comparison, its effect not included. That was a big letdown, especially for 10 and 11-year-olds who were the primary demographic for watching this movie, who we weren't thinking in terms of effect combinations and things like that. All we understood was big numbers equals big better, and Blue Eye Shining Dragon really let down on that front. Sorcerer of Dark Magic, on the other hand, who is on the screen now, much better monster. Stronger than the Dark Magician, much more manageable to summon. Still not the easiest thing in the world, but undeniably better. And I remember I actually made a spellcaster deck for a little while, where this monster was the deck master or the ace monster for it, just because I liked his appearance in this movie so much. I'm actually curious, comment down below and let me know if you made a deck based on any of the cards in this movie. They were all presented like they should have been these really cool archetype cards, and none of them really lived up to the hype. But was anyone else so excited by this movie and just the fact that there was a Yu-Gi-Oh movie that you decided to try to make it work for yourself? It's also kind of interesting to me that Sorcerer of Dark Magic looks a little bit like the redesigned Dark Magician that you get to see in Dark Side of Dimensions. I think that's entirely a coincidence. I'm not fan theorying that one or anything like that. I just think that it's interesting how they took the darker sort of navy blue visual design from this monster and moved it over to the Dark Magician in Dark Side. That's something I didn't really like about that movie, was how much they changed the design of that monster, but I'll talk about that more when I get around to doing the Dark Side of Dimension video, hopefully in just a few weeks. And yes, you heard that right, that means that I do plan on posting videos a little bit faster now. I don't plan on making you wait another year for the next one, though we'll see. Anything could happen. And real quick, while Kaiba has Monster Reborn up here on the screen, you can see the text on that card. I probably should have mentioned this earlier in the movie, but this is, I think, the first time that we ever got to see the actual trading cards as they looked in real life in the English adaptation of the show. If you watch the show in Japanese, the cards look like their actual Japanese OCG card counterparts. But in America, when things were being localized, they don't. You just see the card art and the color of what type of card it is, so monster, spell, or trap card. And of course, if it's a monster card, you got to see its attack and defense points. I don't know why I'm saying all of this. If you've made it this far into the commentary track, you've seen Yu-Gi-Oh! You know all this stuff already. But yeah, so they never showed what the cards actually looked like in the anime. And that's because here in the United States, there are rules that were put into place, I want to say in the 1970s, that had to do with television content aimed at children being, strictly speaking, a commercial. And Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon and a lot of these types of shows got around it, because Transformers is clearly a commercial for the toys. Power Rangers is a commercial for the toys. There's that whole show on Netflix that you can go watch, The Toys That Made Us, and that's all based on shows that got around this rule in one way or another. But strictly speaking, you couldn't make an actual product that kids could buy the subject of a 30-minute or an hour-long episode slot. You couldn't buy real Pokemon or Pokeballs or anything like that in the real world. The Pokemon anime was intended to capitalize on the game sales and sell more copies of the game and whatever associated merchandise they came up with. You couldn't buy an actual Mack truck that turned into a giant humanoid robot like Optimus Prime. You could buy a toy version of that thing. And all of that was fine, but for Yu-Gi-Oh!, you could actually go and buy the cards. The Japanese show was showing actual products that kids could go out and buy. And that would have violated the FCC regulations here in the United States when they were localizing it for English audiences. But, hilariously, none of those rules apply to theatrically released films. If it goes into a movie that's going into movie theaters, which those are always longer than a half-hour or an hour-long television slot, it's totally fine to advertise to kids for an hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever you want to do. So in this movie, they actually do show the English versions of the cards as they appear in the real world, which in some ways makes this movie a more effective advertising mechanism than the anime was allowed to be. Which, as a kid, I actually remember being kind of disappointed that the cards in the real world looked different from the ones in the show. The first Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards that I ever got were the ones that were in the Kaiba starter deck that released in the early 2000s, and I remember when I pulled that out, and I pulled out the Blue Eyes White Dragon card, I was like, this is different, I don't like this. And of course, that's so dumb considering you can't read the cards in the show. Like, I have no idea how any of the characters know how their cards work or know how to use them in the show. But at the same time, maybe that was a little bit more realistic, because obviously no one in the show ever reads their cards. No one knows how their own cards work, they always misplay them, and then they're surprised when their cards can do something awesome and they pull off a unique combo that they never thought of before. So maybe that was more realistic, that the American version didn't have any text and they were just bumbling their way through. At the same time, it's just kind of funny to think back and be like, oh, I wanted the Orica versions of the cards because those ones looked cooler and the ones on TV looked better. Oh, and speaking of the English version of the show, since we've got Pegasus here on screen, Pegasus creates kind of a weird continuity issue in the English adaptation of the show, where Tristan has some sort of a comment in the Waking the Dragons arc where he talks about the last time they saw Pegasus, and it's a reference to this movie. But that means that canonically, in at least according to the English adaptation of the movie, or the franchise, this show does take place within the continuity of the anime, which is fine. It's not a big deal. I talked about this a little bit and said that it doesn't quite work, and that's still true. But here's my big question: if this does take place between seasons 3 and 4, and basically Yugi and company have already gone through this by the time you get to Waking the Dragons and the Kaiba Corp Grand Prix, where is the Blue Eyes Shining Dragon card at that point? Because that's such a big introduction to this movie. Like, you don't have to worry about the Pyramid of Light when things are over, it's gone. You don't have to worry about any of Anubis's cards, they're gone. Maybe we never saw Yugi use Sorcerer of Dark Magic again because he had other things going on, and he does use Wadapon later, so that kind of works. So most of that kind of works. The big glaring omission, if you want to take this movie as canon, is what happened to the Blue Eyes Shining Dragon card. Did Yugi keep it at the end of the movie and that's why we never see it again? Because he can't use it, he doesn't have a Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon card, so it's probably just sitting in the bottom of his closet somewhere. Or is it because this was never actually intended to fit with continuity and I'm overthinking it because that's just what I like to do? I'll let you decide. Let me know in the comments if I'm being crazy or not. But the answer is yes. So at this point in the movie, we've gotten to the fighting the zombies sequence that I was complaining about earlier. And it's frustrating as a viewer because to me it's so obvious what you would do differently to make this whole sequence work. If I had been writing this film, I wouldn't have trapped Yugi and his friends inside of the Millennium Puzzle. If anything, I would have trapped them inside the Pyramid of Light itself. and made that a place where they could see memories of Anubis from the ancient past. You could see a little bit more of his relationship with Atem, and created more insight into their conflict that's going on in the present. Now granted, the Millennium World storyline had just happened prior to this movie airing in Japan, so maybe that would have been a little too redundant going into the past and seeing the old histories and whatnot, but I do think there is something a little bit different about that and what I'm suggesting here, because what I'm suggesting here isn't so much about sending the Pharaoh back and letting him get his old memories and learn about his ancient past and bring his friends into the past with him so that he can overcome the great evil. I'm suggesting something that's more of the opposite. Send Yugi into the past, let him discover secrets of the Pharaoh's ancient past for himself, and then bring something back to the present with him that would allow the two of them to overcome Anubis together. Maybe there was another monster or spirit that was in the ancient past that Yugi could learn about, and when he comes back, do kind of a shining draw thing in order to use that card in order to defeat Anubis. Maybe that was where he discovered the blue-eyed shining dragon, or whatever it was going to be that became the mascot monster of this movie, and let him defeat the bad guy. Not only would that potentially have given us a reason to care about Anubis and consider him to be a more substantial villain on par with the likes of Pegasus or Merrick or Darts or whatever, but it also would have given Yugi an active role in the story. At this point, we're just waiting for him to get back to the Pharaoh, and he's not even the one who leads the whole friendship charge. He's not even the one who helps his partner get to a point where he can win this duel. That's Taya. They play more of the romantic angle than the friendship angle, which is funny considering how much the end of this movie is just hopped up on the idea of friendship is everything. But yeah, so I really can't stand the fact that we're doing all this zombie stuff and there's just no plot development, there's no lore expansion by any of it. It's just filler in a feature-length film, which we should not be having. Even this early in the franchise's history, it was such a rich and inviting world setting. There are so many stories they could have done where they wouldn't have needed to do any filler. They wouldn't have needed to waste time like this, and they could have given us characters to really sink our teeth into and appreciate the way that we've come to appreciate so many of the most iconic characters in this setting. And it's just so disappointing that this movie didn't live up to that. Bonds Beyond Time does do a little bit better. It still has its issues and does a little bit too much of putting the plot first and putting the characters in the story of their development second. And then we get to Darkseid, which I could spend the rest of this video talking about how good Darkseid is. It's amazing how Kazuki Takahashi was able to take the same core premise as this film and turn it into something much deeper and much more compelling. But of course, these are all his characters. He would know them better than any of the animators that Studio Gallop was hiring, or not animators, sorry, writers that Studio Gallop was hiring. For them, it was just, a job, whereas for him, it was his life and his world for a very long time. I'm sure that a lot of people already know this, but he struggled as a mangaka before getting to do Yu-Gi-Oh! And he hadn't worked, he hadn't sold a successful manga run in like 4 or 5 years prior to Yu-Gi-Oh! Getting picked up and published by Jump Comics. So there was a lot riding on it for him, and the fact that this blew up and it became this sensation that changed his life completely, it's one of those interesting scenarios with a creator where you can feel the love coming off of the page, or in Darkseid's case, the screen. The point being, you were never going to get something like that coming out of someone else's interpretation of his work. This movie feels like it was someone's job to make. It feels like it was a product that was meant to capitalize on the success of the anime and the card game. And obviously all of Takahashi's work ultimately served to promote those things as well. There was just a lot more soul to it. I don't think we ever saw that out of the Duel Monsters anime writers the way that we did from him. That's really apparent when you look at the filler arcs in that show. You look at things like the virtual world storyline with Noah, or the Kaiba Corp Grand Prix, or this movie. It didn't have that spark. It didn't have that creativity that came from passion and came from love. And not to get depressing very much here, but now that Takahashi's gone, I wonder if we'll ever be able to see that again in this franchise. A part of me is optimistic that we will, because shows like GX and 5Ds were so phenomenal in spite of the fact that he wasn't really all that involved with the creative decisions behind them. Those were ultimately left to other teams who created their own vision and their own direction for their stories, and as a result, Jaden and Yusei are equally compelling protagonists with Yugi. Like, they don't stand below him, they absolutely stand as equals by the time you get to the next movie, and that doesn't feel unearned, that doesn't feel inappropriate. But whenever someone tries to come back to these characters and do something with them without Takahashi's input or influence, it seems to fall short by comparison. And it's also been a long time since we've had stories like Jaden and Yusei's. I wouldn't say that I ever actively disliked any of the shows while Studio Gallop was producing the intellectual property, but ever since Studio Bridge took over, I haven't liked Yu-Gi-Oh! Very much anymore, or the new stuff that's coming out at the very least. I'm obviously still very fond of and nostalgic for all of this older stuff, but the stuff that's coming out these days is just so disappointing to me, and I wonder what it would be like if Studio Bridge came back to these characters, and would it ever live up to any of the stuff that came before? I mean, with how much I dislike parts of Sevens and Go Rush, I kind of wonder, would Studio Bridge even be able to make a movie as good as this one, or a story as good as this one? And that's not a high bar as far as I'm concerned. I know that franchises rise and fall in terms of popularity over time, but you look at something like Pokemon, which has maintained the popularity that it had back in the 90s. Pokemon Go exploded the franchise back into popularity a few years ago, and then Scarlet and Violet came out this year and were an absolute mess, and everybody was still so excited to jump back into it. And I wonder if the same thing would even happen with Yu-Gi-Oh! If they were to do another anniversary movie or an anniversary event. We've had the Rush Duel format for, 5 years now? Something like that? I can't remember exactly when it started, but we still don't have it here in the US. We still don't have it here for Western distribution. And that's kind of insane when you consider how popular the Duel Monsters era of the show was back in its day. The fact that it just can't resonate with a modern audience the same way really says something about how much times have changed. Especially because, there was a GX generation, there was a 5Ds generation, there were the generations of kids who grew up watching this show at different times who didn't necessarily see the original show, didn't really see much of Yugi and Kaiba, but they fell in love with Jaden or Yusei or Yuma or Yuya or Playmaker. What's his? Yusaku. You had kids who grew up loving all of that stuff, and now Sevens was incredibly difficult to watch here in the United States during its first run with the Western localization. I believe it aired in Canada first, and episodes were pulling in only in the tens of thousands. Nothing compared to what it used to be like before. And so Konami has to ask themselves whether or not it's even worth it to bring the Rush Duel game here to this market, to this demographic, when it's got so little support from the actual target demographic of kids who would be playing the game, and could potentially cut into the TCG sales that were still going strong here in the United States. Older fans continue to play this game left and right and don't need a promotional anime in order to keep it going strong here. But without having some sort of a Rush Duel game or something like that to go along with the Rush Duel animes, I don't even know why they're bothering to localize them for Western audiences. They're pulling in so little in viewership that I question whether or not they're even making back the money that it costs to hire new voice actors and do the English mixing on the show. When episodes routinely aren't breaking 50 or 100,000 views, and you don't have something like card sales or toy sales to make up for that, what's the point of even continuing to produce the show for this audience? And that kind of makes me sad. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is something that's been a part of my life for so long, and I've shared it with my nieces and nephews as they've been growing up, and I don't think I'll really have that, at least not in a new form, going forward. At this point, Go Rush has been airing for more than a year and a half in Japan, and there is no word whatsoever on whether or not there's going to be an English localization, and frankly, I can't blame them. But it didn't have to be like this. There were still really creative stories that could be told in this universe and in this world setting, but I don't think that you're ever going to get those kinds of stories without a visionary like Takahashi or someone that he directly inspired. That was probably the biggest thing that we lost when the series transitioned from Studio Gallop to Studio Bridge. People who had been working on the show for years at that point suddenly were taken off the project, and it was handed to an entirely new team of people who didn't know what to do with it, didn't have the same passion and drive for the series that their predecessors had. And yes, I do think that there had been a decline in quality ever since we had gotten to Zexal. I think that Zexal didn't live up to 5Ds, and Arc 5 didn't live up to Zexal, and Vrains didn't live up to Arc 5. There had been continuous decline in the series as we had gotten further and further away from the initial teams that brought to life shows like GX and 5Ds, because they had the passion to make their own stories and do their own thing in this world setting. And as time went on, there were more people who considered it to be just a job, but you still had the key creatives, and you could see their work shining through in the stories of those later shows. But once we got over to Studio Bridge, that was gone. And this doesn't just apply to this franchise, this is something we can kind of see all over the place. A lot of franchises that have been beloved for a long time feel like they're churning out content that just doesn't live up to what came before. And it's because it's not about telling a creative story. It's not about sharing a story that needs to be told. It's about making a product. It's about making another Star Wars movie or making another Marvel movie, and the passion that was behind those things in the past isn't there anymore. And I don't think that kind of passion comes from being hired to do a job. I think that that kind of passion comes from being immersed in the world of the story. Totally Not Mark, who is a Dragon Ball YouTuber, recently did a series of ultimate reviews for Dragon Ball Z, and in there he talks about how much the series has become a legacy series. There was a passing of the torch from mentors to apprentices, and how in a lot of ways the franchise had been inherited by its fans. Toyotaro, who is the mangaka who currently writes and draws the Dragon Ball Super manga, was a Dragon Ball Z fan. He actually got his start as a mangaka by creating a fan manga of Dragon Balls that went on to become very popular and get a lot of prolific attention on the internet. And that eventually came to the attention of series creator Akira Toriyama, and he became his apprentice or his understudy. And in time, he became the official scribe for the show. This fan who had passion to go out and make his own fan projects for the series became the guy who was in charge of shaping its future direction going forward. Yes, he still has some oversight by Toriyama, but we're all starting to see that he's doing more and more independent work now. He's getting to create his own stories with less oversight and less hand-holding. And so maybe now that Takahashi is gone, that's what this franchise needs. Someone who was a passionate fan of the original who can come in and take it in a new direction if it's going to continue on at all. Personally, I'm okay with this franchise ending after all these years. I don't think that would be a bad thing, but if we're going to keep it going, I think giving it back to the fans and letting someone who grew up with it shape the next generation and the next direction of the series would probably be the best decision overall. And I don't have a suggestion for who that would be or know anything about the various mangaka who came after Takahashi and shaped the direction of the manga projects after Duel Monsters. I don't really know enough about the series creators from each of the different anime franchises or anything like that. I'm not suggesting anyone in general. I'm just kind of romantically saying, wouldn't that be nice? I also believe it should be someone in Japan. I'm not putting myself forward there by any stretch of the imagination, even though I love this franchise and I obviously like doing fan writing and I enjoy writing quite a bit. I don't think I would be the right person for that. But one thing that I would find really cool is if I ever got to make a movie in this franchise, like a live action movie, I'd like to give it the Detective Pikachu treatment, something that's relatively low budget, not like an over-the-top blockbuster or anything like that, but has enough money to do some fun stuff and has sort of a tongue-in-cheek relationship with the franchise, something that is self-aware enough to make jokes about the ridiculousness of the series and how over the top it is and how overblown the premise is, while at the same time having the heart to take it seriously and create a story that honors the work that Takahashi gave us for all these years. And, you know, if Ryan Reynolds wants to voice the Blue Eyes White Dragon or Dark Magician Girl or something like that, all the better. Any movie I ever get to make that, you know, you'd throw Ryan Reynolds into, that's an absolute win. He wasn't in the first one that I produced, but he has a standing invitation to be in any movies that I make going forward. And if by some chance, Ryan Reynolds, you're a giant Yu-Gi-Oh fan and you're secretly watching this video, if you want to be in my movie, tweet me. If it's even still called tweeting anymore. I honestly don't know what's going on with that platform. And I should probably go back to talking about this movie anyways. Hey, does anyone else find it weird that Anubis wasn't like an Egyptian god monster on his own? Like, don't get me wrong, the Pyramid of Light is kind of a cool card. I mean, it destroys the god card, so that's cool all by itself, although I think that they could have made something a little bit more interesting than that by taking Anubis and making him into like the fourth god monster, the evil god monster or something like that, just because Kaiba goes and he gets the Pyramid of Light and he's like, oh, I finally have the power to defeat Yugi, I finally have the skill to defeat Yugi. And I'm like, you just have a fake card that someone threw into your deck that says you automatically beat the biggest challenge you're trying to overcome. Like, the Pyramid of Light is not a creative card, and Kaiba doesn't win through skill, or doesn't start to win through skill. It's all kind of just handed to him. And I think it would have been cool if Anubis had been a different god card, if Kaiba had gotten an evil god card that could actually go toe-to-toe with the other god cards. The way that the gods are used in this movie is just kind of like, they're there to be this unstoppable force, and then they're removed from play, and then they're unstoppable again. And I think it would have been cool if you got to see a nice big clash of the gods between Yugi and Kaiba again, especially because Anubis is an Egyptian god. I mean, there's an entire Egyptian pantheon out there, like Isis and Horus and all these other gods that are mentioned at various points in the Yu-Gi-Oh franchise. Horus is a card series, Isis is Ishizu's name in the original Japanese version, so the other gods are touched on, but never introduced as monsters the way that Slifer, Obelisk, and Ra are. And I think it would have been cool to pull other members of that pantheon and say that they were darker counterparts or competitors to the Egyptian gods, or that maybe the way that those three gods pledged themselves to the pharaohs and to Atem, maybe there were other god monsters that pledged themselves more significantly to his enemies or something like that. Of course, GX did something similar with the Sacred Beast monsters, but there's never been any canon explanation for how they're related to the gods or how they factor into any of this or anything like that, so whatever. Oh, and here's something I didn't pick up until watching the movie again for this commentary track. Kaiba's doing the Vegeta arm clench thing, like he's holding his left arm, which is something, for anyone who's not a fan of Dragon Ball, that's something that the character Vegeta does every time he gets his ass handed to him in that show. It's kind of a shorthand for Vegeta's been beaten and doesn't have enough strength to keep fighting or anything like that. And I think it's funny that they had Kaiba doing that in this movie, because Kaiba was based on Vegeta in a lot of ways. Kazuki Takahashi was a big fan of Dragon Ball and was heavily influenced by that show, and or manga. I don't know if he preferred it as an anime or a manga, but he was a big fan of the character of Vegeta, and that character directly inspired the character of Seto Kaiba, and that really comes across in this movie. There's actually a lot of parallels between those two characters in this movie. They're both proud and selfish characters, and they both make a lot of bad decisions and end up assisting the bad guys purely out of ego and out of pride. In Dragon Ball, during the Majin Buu storyline, Vegeta lets himself fall under the control of the villain of that storyline, and he's completely heedless of the danger that will create for others. He just cares about getting the power that he needs for his own purposes, And Kaiba does the exact same thing in this movie. He doesn't care when Pegasus says that there's something wrong here, and he only created one card that was capable of defeating the god cards. He didn't care when Yugi warned him that there was a danger involved in them dueling one another. He only cared about doing what was best for him, about what was going to satisfy his goals. And there are personal consequences for that. For Vegeta, he ends up sacrificing himself. He blows himself up in order to save the people that he loves. In this movie, Kaiba also has to make a sacrifice. He has to, 1, give Yugi the Blue-Eyes Shining Dragon, give him the card that Kaiba needs in order to settle the grudge or settle the score that he has with Yugi, but also he gives up on the match between him and Yugi. He decides that that isn't more important than surviving the day, and so he doesn't get the perfect victory that he thinks that he's entitled to. It's not quite as emotionally satisfying as Vegeta's storyline. Nothing about this movie is, quite frankly, but it's interesting to see how much Kaiba and Vegeta parallel one another, and how much specifically Vegeta in this storyline parallels Kaiba in this storyline parallels Vegeta from the Majin Buu storyline in Dragon Ball. So if you're a fan of that show, I hope you enjoyed that little analogy and that little parallel. If you're not a fan of that show, I'm sorry I spent the last couple minutes talking about it, because that must have been very boring for you. But was it any more boring than what's going on in the movie right now? Yugi and Kaiba have summoned the Blue-Eyes Shining Dragon to defeat Anubis, and I wouldn't have such a problem with this if that hadn't been the resolution to the duel 5 minutes ago. When Yugi and Anubis were dueling one another and he remembered the power of friendship, he uses Monster Reborn to pull Shining Dragon out of Kaiba's graveyard and uses its power to destroy everything, to destroy the Sphinx monsters that Anubis was using, and he won the duel, and it was a big triumphant moment. And then 5 minutes later, they repeat the exact same moment by having the Blue-Eyes Shining Dragon be the solution to basically the exact same problem. I guess what I'm saying is this whole section where they're fighting Demigod Anubis, or whatever this hell beast is, completely unnecessary. They could have kept it confined to the duel itself, or maybe Anubis could have mutated into this monster creature throughout the duel or something like that. I don't know, but there was no need to do the moment with the Shining Dragon twice. 3 times if you count when Kaiba uses it to destroy the Pyramid of Light, because that's basically 3 moments where the ultra undestroyable magic in this movie can just be destroyed by the Shining Dragon's effect to destroy anything. And that feels a little bit cheap. There's a lot of mythology and lore as to why the god monsters are as powerful as they are, and it's implied that there's just as much backstory for Anubis here in this movie. We don't get to see all of it, but it's implied that it's there. Whereas the Blue-Eyes Shining Dragon is just kind of a blank slate. Pegasus created it because he wanted something that could defeat the god monsters, and it doesn't even really make sense that he created that card. It's part of a very limited archetype that he doesn't control. It requires that you sacrifice a Blue-Eyes Ultimate Dragon, which there's only one of in the world, and Kaiba has it. It's almost like this card was made for Kaiba, that Pegasus wanted him to have it, but nothing about how he behaves or how he acts in the movie implies that. In fact, it's sort of kind of implied that the reason Pegasus wants to get the 3 blue eyes from Kaiba at the beginning of the movie is so he could use Shining Dragon. But why did he make Shining Dragon that way in the first place? He didn't have to, and it's not implied that this monster comes from anything. It's not implied that there was ever a version of Shining Dragon back in the ancient Egyptian times. It's just this thing he made to defeat the god cards that he couldn't even use if he wanted to. Frankly, if he was just going to create a card that would let him beat the god cards, it would have made more sense for him to create something like the Pyramid of Light, where he could just say, oh, the god cards are destroyed. But whatever. But yeah, that is Yu-Gi-Oh! The Pyramid of Light, the first of the 3 feature-length Yu-Gi-Oh! Films, and like I said at the beginning of this video, my least favorite of the 3. And I have to say, this was harder to make than I thought it was going to be. I thought, hey, let's do a commentary track. That'll be some easy content that'll let me start connecting with you guys again. But man, oh man, just sitting here and talking for an hour and a half is a lot more difficult than I thought it would be. And for anyone who thinks that I did this in one take, you're wrong. I had to stop and start and do this 10 different ways from Sunday. and it was much more challenging than I expected, but I also had a lot of fun doing it, and hope you guys enjoyed it as well, because there are a few more of these coming down the road. Our next video on the channel is going to be a similar commentary track for Bonds Beyond Time, and then we'll do one for Dark Side of Dimension. If you follow this channel at all, you probably noticed that over the past year, I haven't posted a whole lot. I've only posted one video this year, and that wasn't by choice. There are several reasons for that, but the biggest and most important one that I'm going to talk about today is that I've been in the process of trying to finish my first feature film. About 4 years ago, my brother and I decided that we were ready to take that step, and we financed and produced a feature-length horror movie. The problem was we started shooting the month before COVID hit. That forced us to shut down production, the cost of things went up, we had to raise additional funds, and what should have been a year-long, maybe a year-and-a-half-long process suddenly ballooned into 4 years, and now we are very close to being done with it and trying to get that wrapped up so that we can start submitting it to film festivals and start working with our shopping agent to get it distributed. And I'm very excited to start sharing information on that with all of you. It's been really hard not to talk about this over the last 4 years because there are a lot of things that are in there that I'm very proud of. I had a great team of people supporting me, and while it is nothing like the kind of stuff I normally do on this channel, it is, I think, a very good movie at the end of the day, and something that I hope the people watching this channel will at least check out when the time comes. But the point is, that's all been a bit of a time suck, so I haven't had a whole lot of time to work on this channel, and that's probably still going to be true for a little while. I get messages on almost a weekly basis saying, hey, are there any more theory videos coming? Are there any more deck profiles coming? When are you going to get back to the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX rewrite or the Duel of Destiny game that you announced a few years back? All good questions. All of that stuff is still happening. All of those things are still in various stages of development and whatnot. The movie just kind of took over priority on all of those things. So yeah, not sure when I'm going to get back to all of that stuff, but I still intend to. As for whether or not there's going to be any content in the channel, I plan on continuing to do things like this. This is much simpler and less time-consuming to do than the theory videos or things that require a lot of in-depth writing, research, and editing and stuff like that. So this is a fun way that I can kind of keep things going and stay connected with all of you rather than going almost a year without posting any content. Because I enjoy working on this channel. I'm very proud of what I've built with all of you, and I want to keep it going. The next couple of videos will finish out the feature-length films in the franchise, and then maybe I'll go back and I'll do episodes or stories from the anime. And not just across Duel Monsters, but, you know, from across the entire franchise. I won't do all 8 series in the show or anything like that, because that's over 1,000 episodes, and even I don't want to hear myself talk that much, but, you know, hitting some of the highlights or things like that. And maybe other franchises as well. I would love to do Dragon Ball commentary, or, you know, branch out and do other things like Star Wars or Marvel or DC or Star Trek or any of the hundreds of other franchises that I've loved for so many years. So, you know, if any of that sounds appealing to you, go ahead and let me know in the comments. That's what they're there for. You'd also really be helping me out if you hit the subscribe bell thing. That way you'll get to hear me nerd out on other videos as soon as possible, and it just makes me feel good inside. And yeah, that's all from me. I will catch you in the next video. Hopefully it won't take me another year to get that one out. I'm aiming for something more like next week or the week after. Again, subscribe if you want to see me pull that off or not. Everybody stay safe and stay healthy, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye!